The raw, unhinged fury in Pansy's voice was a sound George had never heard. He stood frozen, briefcase still in hand, staring at the woman he barely recognized, her eyes blazing with paranoia. He didn't react with the guilt of a caught man. His shock was one of genuine confusion, and beneath it, a familiar, deep weariness at the intrusion of emotion into his ordered world. "Who are you talking about, Pansy?" he asked, his voice low and controlled, a response that infuriated her further. She demanded details about the lunch date, throwing Jack's vague description back at him. George sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose, treating the outburst like an annoying logistical error that needed correcting, which was exactly the coldness Jack had conditioned her to despise. George finally explained the situation, and the details were perfectly mundane. The woman was not a mistress. She was a consultant specializing in optimizing productivity for his firm's specific industry. George had been having regular, brief working lunches because her schedule was tight, a detail he had simply forgotten to mention because it was work. The explanation was boring, clinical, and completely plausible. The relief Pansy felt was instant, but quickly turned into a deeper despair. George hadn't been cheating, but his defense, his clinical lack of passion or defense of his own emotional life, proved Jack's point. George only cared about efficiency. She realized that while George was innocent of infidelity, he was guilty of the emotional neglect that had driven her to this catastrophic point. She collapsed onto the couch, her manufactured fury giving way to bitter tears. George awkwardly patted her shoulders, suggesting she was overworked and needed to book another massage. That clueless suggestion, to send her back to the very place where her crisis started, was the final accidental proof that he would never understand the fire she craved. George looked at Pansy, seeing not a villain, but a man so emotionally muted that she felt profoundly lonely standing right beside him. Jack's planned chaos had failed to confirm infidelity, but it had succeeded in one key way. It isolated Pansy further into believing her husband was a lost cause, solidifying her commitment to her dangerous secret life. She was now completely at Jack's mercy, and he was ready to collect on the debt. The aftermath of the confrontation with George left Pansy emotionally drained, but strangely affirmed. George's inability to grasp the emotional turmoil validated her narrative. She was justified in seeking life elsewhere. Jack, sensing the successful isolation, moved immediately to consolidate his power. He stopped pretending to be her vulnerable soulmate and began to issue directives, using her guilt and desire as currency. Their meetings changed completely. Jack now demanded her full attention, often scheduling their encounters at his convenience and not hers. The passionate intensity he initially offered was replaced by a cold, possessive sexuality that felt less about mutual desire and more about submission. He dictated what she wore, what she said, and, most disturbingly, the precise nature of their intimacy, which was focused solely on his satisfaction. Pansy's compliance was immediate and total. She didn't question his demands, she simply obeyed, confusing the feeling of being controlled with the feeling of being desired. Her self-worth had become entirely dependent on Jack's momentary approval. If he was pleased, she felt momentarily alive. If he was distant, she spiraled into agonizing self-doubt, convinced she had failed to meet his standards. One evening, Jack demanded she leave an expensive piece of jewelry George had given her at home, suggesting it was ugly and a symbol of her caged life. Pansy knew the request was irrational and controlling, a direct attempt to erase George's presence. But the thought of disappointing Jack filled her with such panic that she not only left the necklace, but considered selling it just to prove her devotion to him. She realized in a sudden sickening flash that the freedom she had chased was an illusion. She hadn't traded George's emotional neglect for passion, she had traded it for servitude. She was not Jack's equal, she was her supply, and her primary function was to feed his ego and satisfy his increasingly rigid demands. She saw the trap, but she couldn't break free. The emotional chain Jack had wrapped around her was forged from her deepest insecurities, and she was terrified of the withdrawal that would follow if she cut him loose. But the real danger wasn't just the control Jack held, it was the unexpected person he was about to bring into their toxic arrangement. Pansy was now living a fractured existence. Her days were a blur of professional obligation and mechanical interactions with George, and her evenings were dedicated to fulfilling Jack's increasingly specific and demoralizing demands. She felt constantly drained, the initial aliveness replaced by a dull, aching exhaustion. The only thing keeping her going was the fear that if she stopped complying, Jack would discard her, leaving her with nothing but the wreckage of her marriage. One afternoon, Jack told her to meet him at a discreet, upscale bar on the other side of the city. He was unusually calm, almost clinical. Pansy arrived, already nervous, prepared for a new set of rules or another intense interrogation about her devotion. But Jack wasn't alone. He was sitting with a woman, impeccably dressed and strikingly beautiful, who looked at Pansy with a cold, appraising stare. Jack introduced her as Tiffany, a colleague. He made no effort to explain the situation, simply announcing that Tiffany would now be joining their arrangement. He explained, with a chilling lack of emotion, that for their connection to truly thrive, Pansy needed to learn the art of absolute surrender, and Tiffany was there to guide her. He framed it as an honor, a sign that their bond was evolving to a higher level of complexity. Pansy felt a wave of nausea and rejection. The woman who made her feel special was suddenly a disposable part of a controlled dynamic. Her desperate hope that she was his soulmate was violently shattered. She was merely another interchangeable source of validation. Yet, instead of storming out, the learned dependency took over. Pansy's immediate thought was, how can I please Jack now? Jack leaned in, his voice dangerously low, and told her that if she failed to cooperate and embrace this new dynamic, he would make sure George and everyone else knew every intimate, humiliating detail of their secret affair. The veiled threat wasn't about George's feelings. It was about Pansy's reputation and the destruction of her carefully constructed life. Trapped by fear, shame, and the consuming addiction to his presence, Pansy nodded her head, her voice barely a whisper. She took the seat Jack offered, accepting the cold, critical scrutiny of Tiffany. Pansy had finally understood the depth of her enslavement, but the next revelation would expose the dark history Jack had deliberately hidden. Pansy's world shrunk to the narrow space between Jack's demands and Tiffany's cold scrutiny. The new dynamic was humiliating, a final, brutal confirmation that she was a possession, not a partner. Yet the fear of exposure, the shame of George, the judgment of her friends was so crippling that she complied with every degrading instruction, deepening her role as Jack's emotional and sexual slave. Tiffany was a silent monitor, a permanent, beautiful reminder of her own disposability. One evening, Jack left the room abruptly to take a call, leaving Pansy alone with the other woman. The silence was heavy, but Tiffany finally broke it, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You look tired," she observed, not as a woman offering comfort, but as an observer reporting on a test subject. Pansy, desperate for any shred of connection, risked a question. "How long have you two known each other?" Tiffany looked at her, and for the first time she saw not judgment, but a profound, dead emptiness in her eyes. "Too long," she replied. Then she dropped the bombshell. "I was you, Pansy. I was the soulmate. I was the one who left her husband for him." The revelation hit Pansy like a physical blow. Tiffany wasn't a colleague or an equal. She was an earlier victim whom Jack had so thoroughly broken and isolated that she now served as his assistant and emotional guard dog. She had become so dependent on him that her only way to exist was within his orbit, enforcing his rules on the next subject, Pansy. Tiffany confessed in quick, detached sentences that Jack had used the same tactics: the intense idealization, the research into past trauma, the isolation, and the eventual sexual coercion. She warned that Jack was a master at the discard phase, and when he was finished, he would leave her completely destroyed and alone, just like he had done to countless others. The truth was terrifying, but it also carried a strange clarity. Pansy finally understood that her intense feelings weren't love. They were a toxic, conditioned response to a narcissistic program. She wasn't unique. She was part of a destructive, repeating pattern. The realization granted her a sliver of clarity she desperately needed, but it came too late, as George was already preparing to close in. The truth, delivered cold and flat by Tiffany, burned away the last vestiges of Pansy's illusion. She saw Jack not as a soulmate, but as a predator, a manipulator who collected broken women. The horrifying realization, however, was immediately followed by crushing shame. She had knowingly thrown away her life for a painful lie. This newfound clarity gave her a desperate impulse to escape, but the fear of Jack exposing her kept the chains locked tight. At home, George was no longer just quietly detached. His demeanor had shifted to a tense, analytical suspicion. He hadn't forgotten the unfamiliar scent or the bizarre confrontation. He began paying attention to her phone habits, her sudden lateness, and the profound sadness that now overshadowed her once forced cheerfulness. George was slowly putting the pieces together, using his meticulous, logical mind to solve the puzzle of her distraction. One morning, George stopped Pansy by the door. His voice was steady, but his eyes held a cold certainty that chilled her to the bone. "I know something is going on, Pansy," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. He didn't mention infidelity. He spoke about her absences, her financial carelessness, and the loss of herself. He asked her to choose. "Tell me the truth, now, or I will find out for myself. And when I do, I will be the one making the decisions." George's threat, rooted in logic and control, was ironically the lifeline Pansy needed. It forced a definitive action. However, just as she was considering risking everything to tell him, a new text arrived from Jack. It was a picture of a file folder labeled George and Pansy's Secrets, with the simple, menacing message: "You belong to me. Don't forget who protects your perfect life." The terror of Jack's power, the knowledge that he held the detailed, humiliating evidence of her betrayal, overrode the momentary courage George had sparked. She chose the cowardice of the known danger over the terrifying unknown of confession. Pansy looked George straight in the eye and delivered the ultimate lie, ensuring his silence and her continued enslavement. Pansy had decided to stay silent, sealing her fate, but Jack was about to make a monumental mistake. Pansy's lie, the cold denial she delivered to George, felt like slamming a door shut on her old life. She had chosen the shame of Jack's enslavement over the pain of confronting her marriage, rationalizing that she was protecting George from a truth too ugly to bear. But the relief was non-existent. Only a deep, icy resignation remained. Jack, reassured by her compliance and terrified by his ego, became sloppy. He began treating his apartment like his sanctuary, no longer worrying about covering his tracks. He often left his phone unlocked, trusting that Pansy was too broken and dependent to ever challenge him. He openly discussed his past victories, bragging about how easily he could identify and exploit women craving validation. One afternoon, while Jack was in the middle of a lengthy, self-congratulatory phone call, Pansy, under the pretense of fetching a glass of water, glanced at his phone. She wasn't looking for infidelity. She was looking for a weapon. What she found was a cloud storage app open to a file she hadn't seen before, a video recording of the very first massage session. Her blood ran cold. Jack hadn't just told the truth about being recorded. He had recorded the entire process himself, likely for his own viewing or as future blackmail material. The file confirmed her deepest fear. The entire connection was a performance, and he had violated her privacy from the very first moment. This was the monumental, narcissistic mistake that broke his control. The shame was overwhelming, but the horror brought a sudden, desperate clarity. Pansy realized Jack had not just broken her heart, he had potentially committed a crime. This wasn't just emotional abuse. This was a tangible threat that could expose him, not just her. The discovery was the shock she needed to realize she had to stop being the victim and start being the survivor. Pansy moved with a speed born of pure survival instinct. She quickly memorized the cloud service name and the file path, knowing she had only one chance to escape his web. She couldn't tell George yet, but she now had the key to unlock her own chains. She knew she had to get out of that apartment tonight. But Jack was already testing her obedience one last time. Pansy's lie, the cold denial she delivered to George, felt like slamming a door shut on her old life. She had chosen the shame of Jack's enslavement over the pain of confronting her marriage, rationalizing that she was protecting George from a truth too ugly to bear. But the relief was non-existent. Only a deep, icy resignation remained. Jack, reassured by her compliance and terrified by his own ego, became sloppy. He began treating his apartment like his sanctuary, no longer worrying about covering his tracks. He often left his phone unlocked, trusting that Pansy was too broken and dependent to ever challenge him. He openly discussed his past victories, bragging about how easily he could identify and exploit women craving validation. One afternoon, while Jack was in the middle of a lengthy, self-congratulatory phone call, Pansy, under the pretense of fetching a glass of water, glanced at his phone. She wasn't looking for infidelity. She was looking for a weapon. What she found was a cloud storage app open to a file she hadn't seen before, a video recording of the very first massage session. Her blood ran cold. Jack hadn't just told the truth about being recorded. He had recorded the entire process himself, likely for his own viewing or as future blackmail material. The file confirmed her deepest fear. The entire connection was a performance, and he had violated her privacy from the very first moment. This was the monumental, narcissistic mistake that broke his control. The shame was overwhelming, but the horror brought a sudden, desperate clarity. Pansy realized Jack had not just broken her heart, he had potentially committed a crime. This wasn't just emotional abuse. This was a tangible threat that could expose him, not just her. The discovery was the shock she needed to realize she had to stop being the victim and start being the survivor. Pansy moved with the speed born of pure survival instinct. She quickly memorized the cloud service name and the file path, knowing she only had one chance to escape his web. She couldn't tell George yet, but she now had the key to unlock her own chains. She knew she had to get out of that apartment tonight. But Jack was already testing her obedience one last time. Jack finally ended his call, his eyes glittering with self-satisfaction as he approached Pansy. He gave her a final command, a humiliating request that was intended to be the ultimate test of her obedience before the night ended. But the fear that had once paralyzed Pansy was now superseded by the cold, hard certainty of his betrayal and the threat of the recorded video. The sight of that file had been the shock that snapped the chains of her emotional slavery. She looked at Jack, and for the first time, she saw him clearly. Not as the soulmate, not as the passionate savior, but as a small, toxic man preying on her vulnerability. The learned compliance disappeared, replaced by a surge of pure, freezing anger. Pansy met his gaze and did the one thing she hadn't done since the beginning. She refused. "No," she said, her voice steady and low, cutting through the silence of the room. Jack was momentarily stunned, his narcissistic mask dropping entirely to reveal a flash of genuine rage. He moved quickly, demanding to know what had changed, his eyes narrowing with menace. He reminded her of the blackmail, the files, the destruction he could unleash. Pansy didn't flinch. She simply stated with unwavering conviction that the video was now her evidence and she was leaving. The confrontation was brutal and quick. Jack realized the threat had backfired. His own carelessness had armed his victim. He tried to physically block her exit, but Pansy, fueled by a primal need for survival and freedom, fought back. She wasn't fighting for her marriage. She was fighting for her soul, battling the addiction he had meticulously cultivated. This was the moment she fully realized the truth. The real enemy wasn't George's coldness. It was her own pattern of seeking toxicity. Pansy ran out of the apartment and onto the street, breathing air that felt clean and dangerously free. She didn't go home. She drove to a quiet, anonymous motel and, shaking with adrenaline, sent a cryptic text to George. "I know everything. I need help." She knew the truth would destroy her marriage, but the feeling of self-possession, of having chosen her own path, finally, was a fragile, magnificent victory. She had survived Jack, but the hardest part was yet to come. Telling George the whole, humiliating truth. Pansy sat alone in the motel room, the quiet silence finally allowing the crushing weight of her choices to settle. The relief of escaping Jack was immense, but it was hollow, replaced by the terrifying realization that she was the common denominator in her pain. She saw her life clearly. She hadn't been a victim of George's coldness. She had been a willing target for Jack, subconsciously seeking the consuming, toxic passion she mistook for life. The next morning, she sent the digital evidence of Jack's manipulation and crimes to an anonymous tip line, choosing to dismantle his predatory cycle without involving herself directly in a public spectacle. Jack's world would eventually collapse, not because of George, but because his own arrogance had finally armed his victim. Pansy knew her fight wasn't with him anymore. It was with the broken pattern inside herself. Telling George was the hardest thing she had ever done. He didn't react with rage, but with his typical, devastating emotional distance, treating her confession as a logical conclusion to the chaos he had observed. He accepted the affair, but he refused to accept the depth of her emotional emptiness. They decided the walls of their beautiful, empty house were finally crumbling, and they separated, recognizing that their marriage had died long before Jack entered the picture. Pansy didn't achieve a fairy tale ending. She achieved clarity. She learned that the greatest betrayal wasn't George's neglect or Jack's manipulation, but her own failure to communicate her needs and her tendency to confuse intensity with intimacy. She began rebuilding her life, no longer seeking a man to make her feel alive, but finding the steady, quiet worth within herself. Years later, Pansy understood the profound lesson. She had run from George's quiet indifference straight into Jack's violent obsession, a cycle only broken when she risked total annihilation to save herself. The cost was the destruction of her home, but the reward was the liberation of her soul. she learned that true connection isn't the electrical shock of obsession. It's the comfortable silence of mutual respect. She finally stood alone, no longer defined by a husband's absence or a lover's hunger, ready to face the world not as a partner, but as her own complete person. The scars remained, a painful reminder that sometimes the person you need saving from the most is the desperate, unhealed person you used to be. Every night, George's hand rested right next to hers in bed, yet the distance between them felt like continents. He was her husband, her budgeting partner, but never her accomplice. What Pansy missed most was that electric tension that makes the air vibrate. She didn't go looking for it. She stumbled into it. The massage was supposed to relieve the tension from work, but when the therapist, Jack, pressed hard on the base of her back, she felt an immediate, inappropriate warmth. It was the shock of a body craving to be discovered again, and she couldn't bring herself to pull away. Pansy lay there, face down on the table, the linen smelling faintly of lavender. The air conditioning hummed, a familiar, sterile sound. But the silence inside her head had been utterly shattered. For 8 years she had lived in the quiet routine of George's detached affection, where touch was functional, a pat on the shoulder, a fleeting kiss. She had become so accustomed to the emotional drought that she hadn't realized her soul was parched, craving any drop of true connection. Jack's hands were different. They were confident, almost demanding. When he had first started, it felt like an expert working on knots, but now the pressure point at the small of her back felt less like therapy and more like an ignition. The heat spread instantly, not just in her muscles, but across her skin. A forbidden blush she was thankful the room's dim light concealed. This wasn't just about a touch. It was about the dangerous realization that she was still capable of feeling everything, a sharp contrast to George's gentle numbness. A tight knot formed in Pansy's stomach, a mixture of guilt and pure, unadulterated yearning. This wasn't just physical. This was about being seen again. Jack's hands moved with a purpose that seemed to acknowledge her as an individual, not just George's wife or the woman who manages the dry cleaning. His movement slowed, lingered just a moment too long, and in that held breath, the promise of an intense, soul-shaking connection hung heavy in the air. She knew she should speak, clear her throat, make a professional comment about the pressure, anything to break the spell. But the word stop seemed to catch in her throat, strangled by a desire she hadn't known she possessed, a desire she recognized from her past, the immediate, consuming addiction to a man who saw her intensely. She thought of George, his calculated detachment versus this stranger's electric proximity. The session was almost over, and Jack returned to a more clinical rhythm, easing the tension he had so expertly built. Pansy's heart hammered a frantic, guilty rhythm against the table, but a tiny, selfish voice whispered that she needed to feel this fire again. She knew this was a line she had crossed, and the terrifying part was that this feeling of immediate, reckless devotion was hauntingly familiar. She knew she was falling, but she didn't know how deep the toxicity went this time. Pansy's mind replayed the feel of Jack's hands all the way home, an obsession she hadn't felt since her early 20s, before the stability and subsequent monotony of George. She remembered the thrill of those early intense relationships, the ones that burned bright and collapsed violently. Her rational mind screamed danger, but her neglected heart was singing a dangerous, forgotten tune of being chosen, of being special. The fact that Jack had broken the rules for her, even subtly, made him feel instantly vital. The following day, a simple text appeared on her phone, unprofessional, but direct. It wasn't an appointment reminder. It was Jack, complimenting her inner glow and how therapeutic her presence had been for him. This was the hook. George never noticed her glow, only whether she remembered to refill the coffee pods. Jack was already mirroring her deepest needs: validation, attention, and the feeling of being amused. They began communicating secretly, the digital exchange escalating quickly from texts to late-night calls. He listened to her talk about George's silence, George's work obsession, and the emptiness of her life. He didn't offer advice, he offered understanding, a deep, immediate empathy that made her feel more connected to him after 2 days than to her husband after 8 years. He made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in forever. Jack's stories were equally compelling. He described an intense, sensitive soul who was constantly misunderstood, someone who felt things too deeply for the average person. He painted himself as a victim of past, cold partners. Subtle positioning suggesting Pansy, with her warmth and empathy, was the only one capable of truly loving him. This was the first layer of the narcissistic charm, making her believe they were two kindred spirits against the world. The speed of their connection was dizzying, yet intoxicating. He used powerful, emotional language: soulmates, destiny, twin flames, terms that bypassed her logic and spoke directly to her yearning for drama and purpose. Pansy found herself dressing differently, walking taller, glowing from the secret attention. She was becoming the woman she used to be before George's emotional dampening. In just 1 week, Jack had expertly identified every one of Pansy's emotional vulnerabilities and filled them with intense, addictive praise. The high was breathtaking, a drug she now desperately craved. She felt guilt about George, but the guilt was outweighed by the terrifying realization that she was already addicted to the feeling of being Jack's new obsession. The shift in Pansy's demeanor was visible, even to the emotionally blind George. She was smiling at her phone, suddenly preoccupied with her appearance, and the quiet resignation that had defined her had been replaced by a nervous, almost youthful energy. George, mistaking the glow for a sign of her finally being happier with her own life, commented only that she seemed less drained. That casual, surface-level observation was all the permission Pansy's guilty conscience needed to justify her secret world. Jack had expertly initiated the next phase: isolation. He started subtly criticizing George, not with insults, but with pity. "He sounds like a well-meaning child," Jack would say, or "You deserve a man who speaks your language, not just one who pays the bills." These comments poisoned Pansy's existing dissatisfaction, making her see George's flaws not as benign neglect, but as deliberate cruelty. Jack's constant validation made her feel like he was the only person who truly got it. Pansy's evenings became a tightrope walk of deceit. "Working late," she would tell George, rushing to meet Jack at a discreet coffee shop across town, a place far from the safe radius of their usual life. The conversations were always intense, profound, and overwhelmingly focused on her. Jack made her feel like the center of the universe, something George hadn't done since the honeymoon. She hung on to his every word, terrified of saying the wrong thing and losing this intoxicating lifeline. The physical boundary was the last to fall. After a week of intense emotional intimacy, Jack finally confessed he couldn't stand not holding her. The moment he touched her, not the professional, calculated touch of the massage, but a frantic, desperate embrace, the last of Pansy's self-control evaporated. It wasn't about love, it was about the validation of desire, the feeling of being utterly consumed and wanted, a stark contrast to the polite, distant sex life she had at home. The guilt was overwhelming afterward, a heavy, cold blanket contrasting sharply with the fire Jack ignited. She returned home, looking at George, asleep, phone still in his hand, and saw him not as her husband, but as an obstacle to the feeling of being alive. She felt shame, but that shame was immediately channeled back into her need for Jack, the only person who could make the bad feelings go away with just one text. Pansy didn't realize she wasn't falling in love. She was falling into a cycle. Her emotional need was a wide open wound, and Jack was not a healer. He was simply a master at providing the addictive temporary anesthetic. She was spiraling fast, but the danger of the addiction hadn't fully revealed itself yet. The real problem was that George was about to notice more than just her inner glow. Pansy arrived home later than usual, heart still racing from the forbidden excitement of the encounter with Jack. She had mastered the art of cleaning up, scrubbing away the scent of his cologne, rearranging her clothes, but she hadn't anticipated the one thing she couldn't control: her own state of mind. She walked into the kitchen with an unnatural cheerfulness, too bright, too animated for a Tuesday evening, a performance designed to mask the guilt consuming her. She hated how easily the falsehood slipped out. The small talk continued, transactional as always, until George paused, stirring his coffee. "Did you change laundry detergent?" he asked, his tone flat. Pansy's breath hitched. She had in fact used an unfamiliar scented soap at Jack's suggestion, thinking the floral scent would mask the faint musky scent of his apartment. "No, why?" she asked, attempting a casual shrug while her blood ran cold. George didn't press. He simply looked away, back to his coffee cup. "Just a different smell. Maybe it's the dry cleaning." The topic dropped, but the air felt suddenly thick, heavy with unspoken accusation. Pansy realized that her meticulous planning had failed at the most basic sensory level. The subtle shift in her laundry scent, something George would never normally notice, now felt like a giant neon sign flashing betrayal. This incident terrified Pansy, not because George was close to the truth, but because she recognized the old pattern: the rush of fear, followed by the desperate need for reassurance. She immediately texted Jack, needing his validation to calm the anxious voice screaming in her head. Jack, predictably, turned George's suspicion into a compliment. "He's just possessive because he knows he's losing you. You're too vibrant for him now." That message was her immediate fix. It didn't solve the problem, but it medicated the panic. She clung to his words, choosing to believe Jack's narrative that George was the problem, the oppressor, rather than face the reality of her own choices. She had successfully turned George's mild suspicion into proof that Jack was her only safe space, but she was sinking deeper into his controlled reality. The paranoia from George's scent question lingered, tightening the knot of anxiety in Pansy's chest. She had increased her contact with Jack, treating his intense text like an antidote to her rising guilt. Jack, sensing her insecurity, intensified the love bombing, sending her dramatic declarations about their cosmic connection and how fate had finally brought them together. He was a master at turning her fear into fuel for his ego. One afternoon, Pansy was waiting for Jack outside the coffee shop, hiding behind a large potted plant, a familiar routine now soaked in shame and adrenaline. She accidentally overheard a conversation from two women sitting nearby. They were discussing the local massage parlor, and one mentioned a therapist who had been let go months ago for being too handsy and unprofessional with female clients, often making them uncomfortable. Pansy felt a chilling dread that had nothing to do with George. The woman named the therapist Jack. The name hit her like a physical blow. Jack had told her he recently quit his job because the environment was too stifling for his artistic, sensitive nature, claiming the owner was jealous of his talent. Now, the truth, raw and cold, was exposed. Jack hadn't left. He'd been fired for misconduct. The initial shock was devastating, but the narcissistic cycle immediately took hold. Instead of running, Pansy felt a desperate need to confront him, to make him validate her version of him. She needed him to explain it away, to prove the women were lying, to show her that her connection with him was genuine and different. The thought of losing his validation was more terrifying than the fact that he was a confirmed liar. When Jack arrived, Pansy's voice trembled as she questioned him, carefully admitting the fact that she'd overheard the conversation. Jack didn't panic. He smoothly shifted the narrative. He sighed dramatically, taking her hands, and looked deeply into her eyes, full of feigned pain. "They're trying to ruin me, Pansy. They were jealous of my success, of the way I truly connect with people. They knew I was leaving. I told them I wouldn't stop touching people the right way." He masterfully twisted the truth, painting himself as a martyr for genuine, holistic touch, and his former workplace as a jealous, cold environment. Pansy, needing to believe the man who made her feel whole, swallowed the lie, hook, line, and sinker. But the truth was there now, a tiny, hard pebble in her shoe, a quiet alarm that told her this intense love was built on calculated dishonesty. The knowledge of Jack's lie, that he'd been fired for inappropriate touching, sat heavy in Pansy's conscience, a poison that should have repelled her, but instead seemed to bind her closer. Her initial fear of losing George had been replaced by a terror of losing Jack, the source of her renewed sense of self. She rationalized his past as an unfair persecution of his unique gift, proof that the world was too dull for his intensity. Jet, sensing her increased emotional investment after the confrontation, began the slow, calculated withdrawal of affection. His texts became less immediate, his compliments less effusive. When they met, he sometimes seemed distant, preoccupied with his own deep thoughts or mysterious past wounds. This shift was excruciating for Pansy, like an addict suddenly cut off from their supply. She started doing more to win back the old Jack. She began to initiate the intense conversations, constantly asking if he was okay and offering excessive reassurance that she understood him better than anyone. This was exactly what Jack wanted, to flip the script, forcing Pansy to become the supplier of validation. He would accept her attention with a wary sigh, maintaining a subtle air of martyrdom, suggesting that her questions were sometimes too much for his sensitive soul. One night, during one of their secret meetings, Jack casually made a cutting remark about Pansy's sense of style, suggesting it was a little too suburban for her true, vibrant self. The comment stung, but before she could react, he followed it up with a fleeting, intense kiss, instantly confusing her reaction. This was the classic push-pull dynamic, designed to break down her self-esteem and make his validation feel even more precious and necessary. Pansy returned home feeling insecure and anxious, traits she had thought she left behind in her 20s. She went online and immediately bought clothes Jack would approve of, desperately seeking to close the small, terrifying gap that had opened between them. She was sacrificing her own boundaries and judgment, all to keep the intense gaze of the man who had promised her everything. The emptiness of her marriage hadn't been fixed. It had merely been replaced by the frantic, consuming anxiety of her new addiction to Jack's approval. She was now fully engaged in the desperate dance of winning him back, a dance that was exhausting and isolating. She was so focused on keeping Jack, she barely noticed the toll it was taking on her life with George. Pansy's frantic attempts to regain Jack's full attention were consuming her. She spent hours curating text, choosing outfits, and meticulously analyzing his every reply, trying to decipher if she had said or done something to warrant his recent cool detachment. The intensity of this new emotional labor eclipsed the quiet exhaustion of her marriage, trading one form of servitude for another. Jack thrived on this effort, accepting her adoration as his due while rationing out just enough praise to keep her hooked. The strain finally bled into her home life, not with the confrontation, but with neglect. She forgot to pay an important utility bill, missed a major deadline for a community fundraiser she managed, and worst of all, canceled a dinner with George's parents for the first time ever. Her mind was a constant loop of Jack, leaving no space for her former responsibilities. The once impeccable wife and organizer was starting to crumble. George, who valued predictability above all else, finally reacted. It wasn't anger. It was a cold, procedural dissatisfaction. He didn't ask why she was distracted. He simply corrected the errors and suggested she was overdoing it at work, completely missing the emotional chasm that had opened. His solution was to put a calendar reminder on the fridge, treating her distraction as a scheduling issue, not a symptom of a soul screaming for connection. Pansy looked at George's measured, logical response and felt a profound disgust. He was incapable of seeing her struggle, her pain, or her desperate craving for passion. Jack, conversely, would send a string of furious emojis when she was late, immediately followed by a message saying he can't live without her, making her feel wildly important. The contrast cemented her belief that George was the emotional dead end, and Jack was the only path to feeling alive. This feeling of being misunderstood by her husband fueled her dependence on Jack. She confessed George's reaction to Jack, who instantly framed George's concern as controlling and emotionally abusive. "He's trying to manage you, Pansy. He's terrified of your power," Jack texted. This brilliant piece of gaslighting isolated her further, convincing her that her true self was only safe when hidden with Jack. She felt the relationship with Jack accelerating toward a point of no return. She was ignoring the flashing warning signs, the lies, the manipulation, because the high of being desired was a necessary antidote to the poison of George's clinical indifference. She was sinking deeper, clinging desperately to the man who gave her a voice, even if that voice was only echoing his instructions. Pansy knew she had to see him tonight, and she knew exactly where this dangerous road was leading. During their secret, isolated weekend, Jack was at his most intoxicating. He was attentive, overwhelmingly complimentary, and intensely focused on every word Pansy spoke. He declared he had found her previous relationships fascinating, particularly the early, volatile ones where she sought passion over stability. This high level of attention felt like a warm bath after George's cold indifference, reinforcing her belief that Jack truly understood her complex needs. Pansy confessed the details of her most toxic relationship before George, a dramatic, manipulative man who had left her emotionally scarred and craving intense affection. She explained that she chose George precisely because he was the opposite: safe, predictable, and utterly undemanding. She felt relieved, having finally shared the core reason for her current desperation, not realizing she was handing Jack the blueprint to her vulnerability. Later that night, while Pansy was in the shower, Jack's phone buzzed repeatedly. Curiosity and a flash of the paranoia he had instilled made her check it. It wasn't another woman. It was a search history, left open. How to win back emotionally dependent woman, and identifying patterns of narcissistic abuse victims. The results were laid out in a horrifying clinical display. Pansy's blood turned to ice. She wasn't an anomaly, a soulmate, or a destiny. She was a case study. Jack hadn't intuitively understood her. He had systematically researched her vulnerabilities based on the information she had carelessly given him. His soulful connection was a calculated script, and his understanding was a manipulative technique designed to exploit her exact trauma. The initial pain of the discovery quickly morphed into something far more dangerous: a desperate need to deny the evidence. Her heart hammered, the realization that admitting this was a lie meant admitting her entire escape from George was also a lie, and that she was a fool. She couldn't face that truth. She closed the phone just as Jack emerged, his face radiating his familiar, intense adoration. Pansy forced a smile, sinking into his arms as if nothing had happened. She allowed herself to be swept away by his compliments, choosing the comforting illusion over the devastating truth. She was now actively participating in her own deception. But what she hadn't realized was that Jack had also researched George, and the consequences of that were far more immediate. Pansy's anxiety after seeing Jack's search history was a silent scream. She was trapped between the devastating truth of his manipulation and the overwhelming fear of losing her emotional lifeline. Jack, sensing her momentary distance, switched back to the love bombing immediately. He was overwhelmingly sweet and attentive, which only deepened her confusion, reinforcing the idea that the research was merely preparation for their destiny. The next day, Jack dropped the bomb about George. He claimed, with a tone of grave concern, that he had seen George having lunch with a woman Pansy didn't recognize, describing her in vague detail. He said she looked too interested in his work, and added, "I know you trust him, but I just worry about you, my soulmate." The information wasn't proof of infidelity, but it was perfectly designed to activate Pansy's existing paranoia about George's emotional absence. Pansy immediately understood that Jack had researched George's office schedule or public habits. Instead of questioning Jack's motives for spying on her husband, she focused solely on the fear of George's potential betrayal. This fear was a painful echo of her past, making her ignore the very clear evidence that Jack was the real danger. His calculated concern successfully deflected all blame from himself. Jack didn't stop there. He planted the suggestion, "You need to know the truth, Pansy. You need to test his loyalty to see if he's worthy of your sacrifice." He insisted that Pansy confront George about his lunchtime meeting, not to get answers, but to create chaos. His goal wasn't her well-being, it was to isolate her entirely by guaranteeing an emotional explosion at home. Back home, Pansy felt the pressure cooker of Jack's demand and George's cold silence nearing its breaking point. She practiced the confrontation in her head, hating Jack for forcing this, but simultaneously needing his approval to go through with it. The high stakes of the situation made her feel intensely alive, a morbid replacement for the quiet joy she used to know. That evening, as George walked through the door, tired and distracted as usual, Pansy launched into the confrontation, her voice shaking with a manufactured fury that masked her real fear. She demanded to know who the woman was, unleashing a wave of emotional chaos George had never seen. The look of profound shock on George's face was the first sign that Jack's plan had worked perfectly.